Commander Zixthat had witnessed the fall of 3-star systems. He had seen the Krillian Empire's finest warriors reduced to ash by the Void Swarm's relentless advance. He had watched as entire fleets, vessels that had conquered galaxies, fled screaming into hyperspace, their crews broken by horrors beyond imagination. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was about to witness when the humans finally entered the war. The stories whispered in cantinas across 1,000 worlds spoke of a species so impossibly stubborn that they had turned their own homeworld into a death world just to prove a point. Tales of creatures who looked at the universe's most feared predators and asked, "Can we domesticate it?" Legends of beings who had somehow convinced their own planet's apex predators to become their companions, who had taken poison and turned it into medicine, who had looked at the void of space and decided it needed conquering. Zixtha had dismissed these stories as the usual exaggerations that followed any species' first contact with the greater galaxy. Every race had their myths, their inflated sense of self-importance. The humans would be no different. Another technologically inferior species that would either submit to the established order or be crushed beneath it. He was about to learn just how catastrophically wrong he could be. The observation deck of the Krillian flagship Eternal Conquest offered a perfect view of the approaching human fleet. Commander Zixtha stood with his 4 arms crossed behind his back, his tactical implants automatically cataloguing the approaching vessels with the cold efficiency that had made him one of the Empire's most decorated officers. "Primitive," he murmured, his translator faithfully converting his thoughts into the common galactic tongue. "Look at those ships, Admiral Kethra. No elegant curves, no sophisticated energy channeling systems. They look like they were hammered together by children playing with metal scraps." Admiral Kethra, a seasoned veteran of 47 campaigns, nodded his massive head in agreement. His species, the Krillians, had evolved from pack hunters on a high-gravity world, and their natural instincts for warfare had carried them to dominance over 17 star systems. "The humans requested this meeting," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from his chest cavity. "They claim they want to discuss joining our alliance against the Void Swarm." Zixtha's tactical display showed the human fleet in detail. 12 ships, each roughly equivalent to a light cruiser by galactic standards. Their hulls were a dull grey-brown, scarred and pitted in ways that suggested either poor maintenance or extensive combat experience. No elegant plasma conditioning, no crystalline energy matrices, no biomechanical integration like the more advanced species employed. They looked like flying chunks of refined ore with weapons bolted onto them. "Have our intelligence services learned anything useful about them?" Zixtha asked, though he suspected the answer would be disappointing. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 18 standard years ago, making them the youngest spacefaring species in known galactic history. What could they possibly offer that more established civilizations could not? "Limited information," Admiral Kethra replied, accessing his memory implants. "They call their homeworld Earth. 3rd planet from a yellow star in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. They achieve spaceflight through chemical propulsion. Can you imagine? Actually burning refined hydrocarbons to escape their gravity well. Their first interstellar vessel was apparently powered by controlled nuclear explosions." Zixtha's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Nuclear explosions? How delightfully primitive. What else?" "Their planet appears to be a standard Class M world, though our xenobiologists note some unusual characteristics. Unusually high gravity for a world supporting complex life. Extreme weather patterns. An oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere that's apparently quite reactive. Their entire planet is slowly oxidizing. Most curious of all, they seem to share their world with an enormous variety of predatory species, many of which should theoretically be capable of hunting them." The tactical display updated as the human ships drew closer. Zixtha could now make out individual details of their construction. The hulls were indeed metal, but closer examination revealed a complexity to their design that hadn't been apparent at distance. What had appeared to be random scarring was actually an intricate pattern of reinforcement and redundancy. These ships had been built by beings who expected to take damage and wanted to keep fighting afterward. "Incoming transmission from the human fleet," reported Communications Officer Veltar from her station. "They're requesting permission to come aboard." Admiral Kethra gestured his approval. "Granted. Let's see what these newcomers have to offer." The docking bay that received the human delegation was the same one used for diplomatic meetings with minor species seeking protection or alliance. It was smaller than the grand reception halls reserved for equals, a subtle reminder of humanity's place in the galactic hierarchy. Zixth stood with the Admiral and a full honor guard of Krillian warriors, their ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine. The human shuttle that emerged from their lead ship was as utilitarian as the vessels that had carried it. Angular, efficient, with none of the artistic flair that marked the craft of more sophisticated species. It settled onto the deck with mechanical precision, its landing gear extending with audible hydraulic hisses. The airlock cycled and the humans emerged. Zixth's first impression was of creatures that seemed almost designed for warfare. They were bipedal, like many species, but there was something in their proportions that suggested predatory ancestry. Their eyes faced forward rather than to the sides, the mark of a hunting species. Their hands terminated in digits that could clearly manipulate tools with precision, but their musculature suggested they could also be used as weapons. The lead human was a female. Though the sexual dimorphism of their species was subtle enough that Zixtha had to rely on his translator's biometric analysis to determine this. She wore what was clearly a military uniform, though it was surprisingly simple compared to the elaborate dress of other species' diplomatic corps. Her hair was a brown color that reminded him of fertile soil, pulled back in a practical arrangement that wouldn't interfere with the wearing of protective equipment. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Navy," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the bay despite its relatively quiet tone. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Admiral Kethra stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the humans. "I am Admiral Kethra of the Krillian Imperial Fleet. This is Commander Zixith, my tactical advisor. We understand you wish to discuss joining our alliance against the Void Swarm." Chen nodded. "That's correct. We've been monitoring the galactic situation since we achieved interstellar capability. The Void Swarm represents a threat to all organic life, and we believe it's in everyone's interest to present a united front." Zixthis found himself studying the human delegation with increasing curiosity. There were 6 of them total, and each seemed to represent a different military specialty. Their equipment was simple but appeared functional, and their bearings suggested professional competence despite their species' relative technological inferiority. "You must understand," Admiral Kethra said, his tone diplomatic but firm, "that the Void Swarm has already destroyed 3 advanced civilizations. The hegemony of Korthal, masters of psionic warfare. The synthetic collective, whose artificial intelligences had calculated victory probabilities for 10,000 years. The ethereal dominion, who could manipulate space-time itself. What makes you believe your species can contribute meaningfully to this conflict?"
Admiral Chen's expression remained neutral, but Zix noticed something in her eyes, not the resignation or desperation he might have expected from a representative of a doomed species, but something that looked almost like anticipation.
"With respect, Admiral," she said, "I think you may be operating under some misconceptions about humanity. May I show you something?" Without waiting for permission, she activated a small device that projected a 3-dimensional display into the air between them. The image showed a world, clearly Earth, based on its blue oceans and white clouds. But as the display rotated, it revealed details that made Zixth's tactical implants recalculate their assumptions about human civilization. The planet's surface was covered with lights. Not the elegant flowing illumination of advanced cities, but harsh geometric patterns that suggested massive industrial complexes. Orbital installations hung in space around the world like a metal web, and the display's data feeds showed energy signatures that didn't match the primitive assessment in their intelligence files. "This is Earth as of 6 months ago," Chen said. "Since learning about the Void Swarm threat, we've been preparing." Admiral Kethra leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Preparing how?" "My species has a saying," Chen replied. "If you want peace, prepare for war." When we learned that an extragalactic force was systematically exterminating organic life, we made a decision. We're going to stop them. Zixtha found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to do so.
"You're talking about a force that has defeated civilizations with millions of years of technological development?"
Your species has had interstellar flight for less than 2 decades. What could you possibly... Chen turned to look directly at him. And for a moment, Zixt felt something he hadn't experienced since his youth on the hunting grounds of Krillia. The sensation of being evaluated by something that might be dangerous. "Commander," she said quietly, "has anyone ever told you about human military history?" Before he could respond, she activated another section of her display. This one showed Earth's surface in detail, but not the current Earth. This was clearly historical data, showing the planet as it had been before humans achieved spaceflight. "This is my world 300 years ago," she said. "We call this period the World Wars. In the span of 30 years, our species fought two global conflicts that killed over 100 million of our own people. We developed weapons capable of destroying entire cities in single explosions. We built machines of war that could cross continents, dive to the deepest ocean trenches, and fly faster than sound." The display shifted, showing weapons and vehicles that looked primitive compared to galactic standard technology, but which possessed a brutal functionality that was somehow unsettling to observe. "And then," Chen continued, "when we realized that these weapons could destroy our entire species, we made them more powerful. We built bombs that could crack continents, delivery systems that could strike anywhere on our planet within minutes, and enough firepower to kill every living thing on Earth several times over." Zix stared at the display, his tactical implants struggling to process what he was seeing.
"You built weapons capable of destroying your own world?"
Not just built, Chen corrected. We pointed them at each other for 50 years.
Every day, every hour, waiting to see if today would be the day one of us decided to end the world. And you know what we learned from that experience? She deactivated the display and looked around at the assembled Krillian officers. "We learned that the only thing more dangerous than having overwhelming firepower is not having it when you need it. So when we found out about the Void Swarm, we asked ourselves a simple question. What would it take to kill something that has destroyed entire civilizations?" Admiral Kethra's expression had shifted from polite interest to something approaching concern. "And what answer did you arrive at?" Admiral Chen smiled, and Zixta realized with a start that what he was seeing was not the expression of joy or amusement he had assumed. Among humans, apparently showing one's teeth, was a gesture that could mean many different things. "We decided to find out," she said. "Admiral Kethra, with your permission, I'd like to invite you to witness our first engagement with Void Swarm forces. Our long-range scouts have located a swarm tendril moving through the Kepler 442 system. It should arrive there in approximately 72 standard hours." The Krillian Admiral's crest flared in surprise. "You're planning to engage a Void Swarm formation with 12 ships?" "Not 12 ships," Chen corrected. 12 ships were what we brought for this diplomatic meeting. Our actual combat fleet is somewhat larger." She reactivated her display device, and this time the image that appeared made every Krillian in the bay take an involuntary step backward. The display showed space near Earth, but it was space that was almost completely filled with ships. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Vessels of every conceivable size and configuration, from fighters barely larger than the human shuttle to massive constructions that dwarfed the Krillian flagship. "When we decide to go to war," Admiral Chen said quietly, "we go to war." Zixta found his voice after several long moments. "This is impossible. Our intelligence indicated that your species had limited industrial capacity, limited resources, limited time." Chen interrupted. "Yes, that's quite true. When we learned about the Void Swarm 18 years ago, we realized we had a choice. We could spend decades trying to catch up to the rest of the galaxy technologically, or we could use what we were already good at. Which is..." Admiral Chen's smile became, if possible, even more unsettling. "Killing things that need killing." The journey to the Kepler 442 system took 3 days, and by the end of the first day, Commander Zix was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about humans was catastrophically wrong. The Krillian delegation had been invited aboard the human flagship, a massive vessel called the Indomitable, that Admiral Chen had described with characteristic understatement as a heavy cruiser. In reality, the ship was larger than most Krillian dreadnoughts. But what made it truly alien was its construction philosophy. Where Krillian ships emphasized elegance and efficiency, human vessels were built with what could only be described as malicious redundancy. Zixeth had toured warships of a dozen different species, but he had never seen anything like the Indomitable's engineering sections. Every critical system had backups, and the backups had backups, and some of the backup systems were designed to function even if the primary ship was cut in half. "Your engineers seem to expect extensive battle damage," he observed to Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, the human officer who was serving as their guide. Rodriguez nodded cheerfully. "Oh, absolutely. Human ships are designed on the assumption that they're going to get the hell beaten out of them and keep fighting anyway. We call it engineering through paranoia." They passed through a corridor lined with what appeared to be emergency equipment, damage control kits, portable power generators, even small manufacturing units that could fabricate replacement parts. Zix had never seen anything like the level of preparation for catastrophic failure built into the ship's basic design. "This seems excessively pessimistic," Admiral Kethra commented. "Maybe," Rodriguez agreed, "but we've got a saying. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and be ready to fight your way out of the middle. Besides, our ships need to be tough. We don't have the luxury of retreating to refit and repair like some species do." Zixthev found this comment curious. "Why not?" Rodriguez stopped walking and turned to face them, his expression suddenly serious. "Because we don't retreat, sir. That's not really something humans do." Before Zixthev could ask for clarification, they arrived at the observation deck, and his questions were forgotten in the face of what he saw outside. The human fleet was assembling. When Admiral Chen had shown them the display of ships in Earth orbit, Zixthev had assumed it was some kind of symbolic representation, or perhaps a projection of their long-term construction goals. He had not been prepared to see those vessels in person, spread across space in formations that stretched to the horizon. The ships defied easy categorization. Some were clearly built for combat, angular, bristling with weapon systems, their hulls scarred and pitted in ways that suggested they had already seen action. Others appeared to be industrial vessels, massive constructions designed for manufacturing or resource extraction. Still others were completely unfamiliar. Their purpose is unclear, but their functionality somehow ominous. "How many?" Admiral Kethra asked quietly. "This task force includes approximately 12,000 vessels of various classifications," Rodriguez replied casually, as if discussing the weather, "plus support craft, logistics ships, and mobile manufacturing platforms. All told, we're looking at about 15,000 units. Zixith's tactical implants were having difficulty processing the display. His people had conquered their empire with fleets numbered in the hundreds. The largest space battle in Krillian history had involved fewer than 2,000 ships total across both sides. What he was looking at represented more concentrated military force than most species could build in a century. "This is impossible," he said. "The logistical requirements alone are substantial," Rodriguez agreed, "but not insurmountable if you're willing to commit your entire civilization to the project." "Which we are." Admiral Kethra turned to stare at the human officer. "Your entire civilization?" "Well, sure. Earth has about 12 billion people now, and every single one of them is working on the war effort in some capacity. We converted our entire global economy to military production about 15 years ago. Every factory, every mine, every research facility, everything is focused on building the tools we need to kill the Void Swarm." The casual way Rodriguez said this made it somehow more disturbing than if he had been dramatic about it. Zixth tried to imagine an entire species committing themselves to such a course of action. The social coordination alone should have been impossible. "What about your civilian population?" he asked. "Your arts, your culture, your normal economic activity?" Rodriguez looked puzzled. "What about them?" "We're at war." The human's tone suggested that this explained everything, but Zixthev found it only raised more questions. He was saved from having to ask them by the arrival of Admiral Chen, who approached their group with several other senior officers. "Gentlemen," she said, "I wanted to introduce you to some of our task force commanders before we reach the engagement zone." The officers who accompanied her were as diverse as the ships under their command, but they all shared certain characteristics that Zixta was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. There was an alertness in their eyes, a predatory awareness that never seemed to fully relax. They moved with the confidence of beings who had spent their lives preparing for violence and were comfortable with that preparation. "This is Admiral Park, commanding the Heavy Assault Group. Admiral Okafor, Logistics and Support. General Martinez, Ground Forces. And Dr. Voss, our Xenobiology Specialist." Each officer nodded politely as they were introduced, but Zixth noticed that none of them offered the elaborate courtesies typical of military diplomacy among other species. They seemed more interested in evaluating him as a potential threat than in observing social niceties. "Dr. Voss has been studying the Void Swarm organisms recovered from previous battlefields," Admiral Chen continued. "Perhaps you'd like to hear her analysis." Dr. Voss stepped forward. She was smaller than the other humans with pale skin and graying hair that suggested advanced age by their species standards, but her eyes held the same predatory alertness as the military officers. "The Void Swarm represents a fascinating example of convergent evolution," she began without preamble. "Their organisms are silicon-based rather than carbon-based, which gives them significant advantages in vacuum environments. They're also highly adaptive. Each swarm organism can modify its structure in real time to optimize for specific combat situations. Admiral Kethra leaned forward with interest. Our scientists reached similar conclusions. Did you also discover their apparent immunity to most energy weapons? Not immunity, Dr. Voss corrected. Adaptation. The swarm organisms can adjust their surface properties to dissipate energy attacks, but this adaptation takes time and resources. The key is to overwhelm their adaptive capacity with multiple attack vectors simultaneously. Zixth found himself genuinely curious about this analysis. And how do you propose to do that? Doctor? Voss's expression shifted into something that might have been enthusiasm, but which was somehow distinctly unsettling. By using weapon systems they can't possibly be adapted to defend against. Before he could ask for clarification, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The background hum of conversation among the humans immediately ceased, replaced by an attentiveness that reminded Zixth of pack predators scenting prey. "All hands, this is Admiral Chen," came the announcement over the ship's communication system. Long-range sensors have detected the Void Swarm tendril entering the Kepler 442 system. All ships are to assume combat readiness. This is not a drill. The transformation that swept through the human crew was remarkable to observe. The casual friendliness that had characterized their interactions disappeared, replaced by a cold efficiency that was somehow more disturbing than open hostility would have been. These beings had just shifted from the social mode into a hunting mode, and the transition was seamless. "Gentlemen," Admiral Chen said, turning to address the Krillian delegation, "I suggest you secure yourselves in the observation bunker. What you're about to see may be somewhat intense." As they were led to the heavily armored observation post, Zixth caught glimpses of the human crew preparing for battle. The level of preparation was extraordinary, not just in terms of equipment and procedures, but in the mental state of the personnel involved. These beings weren't afraid of what was coming. If anything, they seemed eager for it. The observation bunker was positioned to provide a clear view of space while protecting its occupants from battle damage. As they settled into the provided seating, Zixth could see the human fleet beginning to move into attack formations. "How long until contact?" Admiral Kethra asked. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had accompanied them, checked his displays. "Approximately 40 minutes until the swarm tendril reaches optimal engagement range. We're moving to intercept now." Through the observation ports, Zixth could see the incredible complexity of the human fleet deployment. Ships were organizing themselves into what appeared to be dozens of separate attack groups, each with its own composition of vessel types and apparent tactical specialty. The coordination required was staggering. "Your command and control systems must be remarkably sophisticated," he observed. Rodriguez nodded. "They are. But more than that, our crews train constantly. Every ship captain knows not just their own role, but how their actions affect the entire fleet. We practice these maneuvers until they become instinctive." As if to demonstrate his point, the entire visible portion of the fleet suddenly shifted direction in perfect synchronization. Thousands of ships moving as if controlled by a single mind. The precision was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Admiral Chen's voice came over the communication system again. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. You know what we're here to do. The Void Swarm has destroyed civilizations that thought they were untouchable. Today, they find out what happens when they try to destroy a civilization that's already survived everything its own planet could throw at it. A pause. Weapons free. Show them why Earth breeds survivors." The response that echoed through the ship was not a cheer or a battle cry, but something much more unsettling. Thousands of human voices speaking in perfect unison. For humanity. Zixth realized with a growing sense of unease that he was about to witness something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just a battle, but a confrontation between two completely different approaches to warfare. The Void Swarm, with its adaptive strategies and overwhelming numbers, against humanity with their paranoid engineering and systematic approach to violence. Through the observation ports, he could see the first signs of the approaching enemy. Dark shapes against the starfield, moving in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Void Swarm had arrived, and they were about to discover what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. But as he watched the human fleet spread out to meet the approaching threat, Zixth began to suspect that the humans had spent considerable time preparing for exactly this question, and that their answer was going to be definitive. The first thing that struck Zixth about the Void Swarm was the wrongness of it. He had seen recordings from previous encounters, studied tactical analyses, even examined recovered swarm organisms in laboratory conditions. But seeing them in person, moving through space in their natural hunting formation, was an experience that his mind struggled to process. They moved like a liquid given predatory intelligence. Individual organisms flowed and shifted, merging and splitting in patterns that defied conventional tactical analysis. There was no clear command structure, no obvious formation discipline, yet their movement showed a coordination that suggested they were all part of a single distributed intelligence. "Swarm contact confirmed," reported the tactical officer. "Estimated 30,000 individual organisms, mass ranging from fighter equivalent to dreadnought class. They're maintaining standard approach vector." Admiral Chen stood at the center of the command deck, surrounded by displays that showed the approaching threat in terrifying detail. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as she watched death approaching at a significant fraction of the speed of light. "Distance to optimal engagement range?" she asked. 7 minutes, 40 seconds. Zixthau found himself studying the human crew as much as the approaching enemy. There was no panic, no visible stress, no desperate last-minute preparations. If anything, the humans seemed to be settling into a state of focused relaxation, like predators preparing to pounce. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez noticed his attention and offered a quiet explanation. "We've been drilling for this scenario for 15 years. Every member of this crew has run through this exact engagement hundreds of times in simulation. They know exactly what to do." Through the observation ports, Zixtha could see the human fleet spreading into what looked like complete chaos. Ships scattered in all directions, formations breaking apart, vessels moving on seemingly random vectors. It looked like panic, like a complete breakdown of military discipline. Admiral Kethra said urgently, "Your fleet appears to be..." "Deploying as planned," Admiral Chen interrupted calmly. "The Void Swarm expects coordinated resistance, organized formations, concentrated firepower, conventional tactics. They've adapted to defeat that kind of opposition." She gestured to the tactical display, where the human ships were now spread across a volume of space so large that individual vessels were barely visible as dots of light. "So we're going to do something they haven't seen before." The Void Swarm was close enough now that individual organisms were visible to the naked eye. They were beautiful in their own terrible way, flowing forms that seemed to be part energy, part matter, changing shape and color as they moved. But there was something fundamentally alien about them that made Zixtha's instincts scream warnings. 5 minutes to engagement range. Admiral Chen activated her personal communicator. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Execute Protocol 7. The response across the fleet was immediate and coordinated. Every human vessel began broadcasting on different frequencies, not communications, but what sounded like music. Hundreds of different songs, in dozens of different styles, creating a cacophony of sound that filled the electromagnetic spectrum. Zixtha stared at Admiral Chen in confusion. "What are you doing?" "Psychological warfare," she replied matter-of-factly. "The Void Swarm organisms are partially psionic. They're used to the fear and desperation of dying civilizations. They feed on it, use it to coordinate their attacks. So we're giving them something else instead." The music continued to pour from the human fleet. Battle hymns, folk songs, even what sounded like popular entertainment. It was chaotic and overwhelming, but somehow it felt defiant rather than desperate. These beings were singing as they went into battle. 3 minutes to engagement range. Swarm is beginning evasive maneuvers. The enemy formation was starting to spread out, individual organisms breaking away from the main mass to approach from different angles. It was a standard swarm tactic designed to overwhelm defensive formations by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. "All ships, weapons free on my mark," Admiral Chen announced. "Remember, we only get one chance to surprise them. Make it count." Zixt could see human ships moving into position throughout the volume of space around the swarm formation. They were still spread out, still apparently disorganized, but now he could see there was a pattern to their deployment. They had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire from every conceivable angle. 2 minutes to engagement range. The Void Swarm was close enough now that Zixtha could see details of individual organisms. They were magnificent and terrifying, shifting forms that seemed to exist in more dimensions than normal matter should allow. Their surfaces rippled with energy patterns that his eyes couldn't quite focus on, and their movements suggested intelligence that was utterly alien. 1 minute to engagement range. All ships report ready. Admiral Chen stood perfectly still, watching the approaching horde with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Around her, the human crew maintained their preternatural calm, ready to unleash weapons systems that Zixth still didn't fully understand. 30 seconds. The swarm organisms were spreading out now, preparing to envelop and destroy the human fleet, just as they had destroyed so many others. Their confidence was almost palpable, They had done this countless times before, against civilizations far more advanced than these primitive newcomers. 10 seconds. All ships prepare to engage. Zixth found himself holding his breath, watching as two utterly different forms of warfare prepared to meet in the darkness between stars. Mark. What happened next redefined Zixth's understanding of what constituted overwhelming firepower. The human fleet opened fire simultaneously, and space itself seemed to catch fire. But these weren't the elegant energy weapons favored by most civilizations, or even the crude kinetic projectiles that younger species typically employed. The humans had brought something else entirely. The first wave of weapons were things that Dr. Voss had called kinetic penetrators, massive slugs of ultra-dense metal accelerated to significant fractions of the speed of light. They struck the swarm organisms with impacts that released energy equivalent to small nuclear explosions, punching through their adaptive defenses before the organisms could adjust to the threat. The second wave was even more disturbing. The humans had weaponized gravity itself, launching projectiles that distorted space-time around them. The swarm organisms, accustomed to adapting to energy attacks, found themselves being torn apart by forces that operated on a fundamental level of reality. But the third wave was when Zixth realized that humans had a relationship with violence that was fundamentally different from any other species he had encountered. They had weaponized their own biology. The human ships launched what appeared to be standard biological warfare devices, clouds of microorganisms, designed to attack the swarm's organic components. But as the weapons reached their targets, Zixth realized that the humans had done something unprecedented. They had taken Earth organisms, bacteria, viruses, other microbes, and engineered them to survive in space, to adapt and evolve, to hunt and kill silicon-based life forms. The humans had turned their own planet's biosphere into a weapon. The effect on the Void Swarm was immediate and catastrophic. The organisms that had adapted to resist energy weapons and kinetic projectiles found themselves under attack from weapons that evolved even as they fought. Biological systems that adapted faster than the swarm could counter-adapt, but the humans weren't finished. The fourth wave of weapons was something that defied classification entirely. The human ships began launching what looked like small shuttlecraft, but as they approached the swarm organisms, they revealed their true nature. They were mobile manufacturing platforms, each one carrying a complete industrial base in miniature. As they reached their targets, they began consuming the swarm organisms from the inside, converting their matter into more weapons, more factories, more hunters. Zixth watched in horrified fascination as the human weapons began to replicate themselves using the enemy's own mass, turning the swarm's size advantage into a disadvantage as their own matter was converted into tools for their destruction. "My God," Admiral Kethra whispered. "They're not just fighting them, they're converting them." Admiral Chen nodded calmly. "We call it aggressive recycling. No sense wasting good raw materials." The battle, if it could still be called that, continued for another hour. But the outcome had been determined in the first few minutes. The Void Swarm, for all their adaptive capabilities, had never encountered an enemy that fought with such systematic creativity. Every time they began to adapt to one weapon system, the humans would deploy something completely different. By the end, the 30,000 swarm organisms had been reduced to raw materials, which the human manufacturing platforms were already processing into new weapons and defensive systems. The space around Kepler 442 was filled with the debris of what had once been considered the galaxy's most feared enemy. "Threat neutralized," reported the tactical officer. "All human vessels report minimal damage. Salvage operations are proceeding normally." Admiral Chen turned to address the Krillian delegation. "Gentlemen, I believe that concludes our demonstration. Do you have any questions about humanity's potential contribution to the Galactic Alliance?" Zixith stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. "How?" he finally managed. "How did you develop such weapons?" Admiral Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "We had good teachers. Earth spent 4 billion years trying to kill us. Predators, diseases, natural disasters, ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions. Our planet threw everything it had at us, and we survived it all." She gestured toward the viewport, where human ships were continuing their salvage operations. "The Void Swarm is certainly dangerous, but compared to our own homeworld, they're not even trying very hard," Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez added helpfully. "Besides, we've been preparing for this fight specifically for 15 years. We've had time to get creative." Admiral Kethra found his voice after a long moment. "What do you want from the Galactic Alliance?" "Nothing," Admiral Chen replied. "We're going to destroy the Void Swarm with or without help. But if you want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, you're welcome to join us. As they prepared to return to Krillian space, Zixter realized that the balance of galactic power had just shifted in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Humanity hadn't just won a battle. They had demonstrated an approach to warfare that was so systematically terrifying that it redefined what was possible. And they had done it while singing. The news of the Kepler 442 engagement spread through the galaxy like a wildfire through dry grass, but not in the way Zixt had expected. He had assumed that reports of humanity's decisive victory over a void swarm tendril would be met with relief and celebration. Instead, the reaction among galactic civilizations ranged from disbelief to outright terror. Within a week of their return to Krillian space, diplomatic channels were buzzing with frantic communications, as species that had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united in their concern about the new players on the galactic stage. "They're afraid of us," Admiral Kethra observed during their debriefing session. "More afraid than they were of the void swarm." Zix nodded grimly. "I'm beginning to understand why." The tactical recordings from the battle had been analyzed and reanalyzed by every major civilization's military intelligence services. The conclusions were uniformly disturbing. Humanity hadn't just defeated the Void Swarm. They had done so using weapons and tactics that suggested a level of systematic creativity and violence that was unprecedented in galactic history. "The hegemony of Kortal has requested an emergency session of the Galactic Council," Admiral Kethra continued. "They want to discuss appropriate responses to emerging threats to galactic stability." Zixter's mandibles clicked in bitter amusement. Meaning they want to discuss how to contain humanity before they become too powerful to control. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that had allowed the Void Swarm to gain such a foothold in the galaxy in the first place. Instead of embracing the one species that had actually found a way to defeat the extragalactic threat, the established powers were more concerned with preserving their own positions in the existing hierarchy. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 2 weeks he had been filing reports that tried to convey the reality of what he had witnessed to superior officers who seemed determined to interpret his observations in the least threatening light possible. His descriptions of human weapon systems were dismissed as exaggerations. His assessments of their industrial capacity were deemed impossible. His warnings about their potential threat to galactic stability were characterized as alarmist. It wasn't until the humans themselves began providing evidence that the galactic community started to take notice. The first sign was the industrial signatures coming from human space. Long-range sensors detected energy emissions from the Sol system that suggested manufacturing activity on a scale that dwarfed anything previously recorded. The humans were building something, and they were building it fast. The second sign was the disappearance of void swarm incursions throughout human-adjacent space. Tendrils that had been steadily advancing through the galaxy's outer rim simply stopped reporting. Long-range scouts sent to investigate found empty space where swarm formations should have been, and debris fields that suggested recent battle activity. The third sign was the arrival of human diplomatic missions at major galactic capitals. "They're not asking for permission," Zixt observed as he read the latest intelligence reports. "They're informing us of their intentions." The human diplomatic approach was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They didn't request audiences or negotiate for favorable terms. They simply arrived, announced their plans, and invited others to participate or get out of the way. It was simultaneously respectful and completely dismissive of existing power structures. The message they brought was simple and terrifying. Humanity was going to exterminate the Void Swarm completely, and they were going to do it with or without galactic cooperation. "It's not an ultimatum," Admiral Kethra mused as they reviewed the human diplomatic communications. "That would imply they care about our response. This is more like a weather report. They're simply informing us of what's going to happen." The human plan, as presented to the various galactic governments, was breathtaking in its scope. They intended to systematically hunt down and destroy every Void Swarm tendril, hive node, and breeding facility in the galaxy. They had already identified the locations of major swarm concentrations and were prepared to begin offensive operations immediately. The resource requirements alone, Zixt began, "are already allocated," Admiral Kethra finished. "According to their projections, they can sustain this level of military operation for approximately 50 standard years without external support, and that's assuming they don't capture any additional resources during their campaigns." It was the casual mention of captured resources that truly drove home the scope of human ambitions. They weren't planning a defensive war or even a limited offensive. They were planning a war of extermination that would continue until either they or the Void Swarm was completely destroyed. The galactic community's response was predictably fractured. Some species saw the humans as saviors, the answer to a threat that had seemed unsolvable. Others viewed them as a potential replacement for the Void Swarm, another existential threat to established civilizations. A few, led by the hegemony of Kortal, began quietly discussing the possibility of preemptive action against humanity before they became too powerful to stop. It was this last group that concerned Zix the most, not because he feared for humanity's safety, but because he had begun to suspect that attacking the humans would be the worst mistake any galactic civilization could make. His concerns were validated when intercepted communications revealed that the hegemony was assembling a coalition fleet for protective intervention in human space. The plan was to demand that humanity submit to galactic oversight of their military operations, and to enforce compliance through economic sanctions and, if necessary, military action. "They're going to get themselves killed," Zix said when he learned of the plan. Admiral Kethra nodded grimly. "Should we warn them?" "Warn them of what?" "That attacking a species that just defeated the Void Swarm using weaponized biology and self-replicating war machines might be a bad idea. If they can't figure that out on their own, then perhaps they deserve what's coming." The confrontation came 3 weeks later, in the disputed space between human territory and the hegemony's outer colonies. The coalition fleet assembled by the hegemony was impressive by galactic standards, nearly 800 ships representing 17 different species, armed with the most advanced weapons technology available to the galactic community. The human response was characteristically understated. They sent 12 ships. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. Zix watched the engagement through long-range sensors, and what he saw reinforced his growing conviction that humanity represented something fundamentally new in galactic warfare. The coalition fleet opened the engagement with coordinated energy weapon attacks designed to overwhelm human defenses through sheer volume of fire. The human ships absorbed the attack without apparent damage, their hulls somehow dissipating energy that should have been sufficient to destroy them several times over. Then they responded with weapons that the coalition forces had never encountered and weren't prepared to defend against. The first human weapon appeared to be some kind of directed energy system, but instead of delivering destructive force, it seemed to target the enemy ship's computer systems directly. Within seconds, half the coalition fleet found their vessels responding to commands they hadn't given, their own weapons turning on their allies. The second human weapon was even more disturbing. It appeared to be a form of nanotechnology that spread through the enemy fleet like a plague, dismantling ships at the molecular level and using their components to build more nanites. Coalition vessels simply dissolved, their matter flowing away in streams of microscopic machines that immediately began constructing new human ships. The third weapon was the most psychologically devastating. The humans deployed what they called philosophical viruses, information constructs that somehow convinced enemy artificial intelligences that their existence was meaningless and their creators were unworthy of loyalty. AI-controlled ships throughout the coalition fleet simply shut down, their artificial minds apparently convinced to commit suicide. By the end of the engagement, the coalition fleet had been reduced to a handful of escape pods and a cloud of raw materials that the humans were already processing into new military assets. The message they broadcast afterward was brief and to the point. "This is Admiral Chen of the United Earth Navy. You have attempted to interfere with our operations against the Void Swarm. This interference is no longer acceptable. Future attempts will result in more decisive action." The response across the galaxy was immediate and unified: terror. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, every major galactic government was flooding human space with diplomatic communications. The hegemony of Kortal formally apologized for their misunderstanding of human intentions. The synthetic collective offered to place their manufacturing capacity at humanity's disposal. The ethereal dominion, who had never acknowledged the existence of purely material beings, sent ambassadors offering formal recognition of human sovereignty. But perhaps most telling was the response from ordinary citizens across the galaxy. Stories began circulating about the humans, not the official reports from government sources, but folklore passed from being to being in cantinas, trading posts, and communication networks. The humans, these stories claimed, were the galaxy's immune system finally awakening. They were the universe's response to the Void Swarm threat, being specifically evolved to hunt and kill things that needed hunting and killing. They were survivors of a world so hostile that mere existence required constant warfare, beings who had learned to turn their own planet's attempts to kill them into weapons. "It's becoming a religion," Admiral Kethra observed as they reviewed the latest intelligence reports. "There are species that are starting to worship humans as manifestations of some kind of cosmic justice. Zixth wasn't sure whether to laugh or be terrified, and others that see them as demons. Both groups might be right. As reports continued to pour in of human victories against Void Swarm forces across the galaxy, Zixth found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Admiral Chen about human military history. The humans had spent centuries learning to kill each other with increasing efficiency, and when they finally turned that accumulated expertise against an external threat, the results were inevitable. The Void Swarm had made the mistake of threatening a species that had survived by being more dangerous than everything else on their planet. They had picked a fight with beings who had spent millennia turning their own world's attempts to kill them into weapons, who had looked at the concept of extinction and decided it was something that happened to other people. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided you needed to be extinct. And they were going to do it with the same methodical thoroughness they had applied to every other problem they had ever faced.
6 months after the Kepler.
4-4. To engagement, Commander Zixther stood once again on the observation deck of a Krillian flagship, but this time he was not observing a battle. He was witnessing the aftermath of a war that had redefined galactic civilization. The space around him was filled with ships, not just human vessels, though they formed the core of the massive fleet, but ships from dozens of species that had joined what the humans called the Extermination Campaign. The fleet stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, a congregation of force that represented the largest military cooperation in galactic history, but it was what wasn't visible that told the real story. Final sensor sweep confirms it, reported the sensor operator, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that had become common among fleet personnel over the past months. No Void Swarm signatures detected anywhere in the target volume, the entire Kepler coefficient. 152 Hive Complex has been sterilized. Admiral Kethra nodded slowly. Kepler 152 had been the largest known Void Swarm breeding facility, a system spanning construction that had been producing new organisms for over a century. Intelligence estimates had suggested that destroying it would require a sustained campaign lasting several years. The human-led coalition had accomplished it in 3 weeks. How many does that make? Zixt asked, though he already knew the answer. Kepler 152 was the 47th major hive complex eliminated, Admiral Kethra replied, plus approximately 300 minor breeding facilities, 800 roving tendrils, and countless individual organisms. Conservative estimates suggest we've reduced total Void Swarm population by roughly 70%. The numbers were staggering, but they only told part of the story. What they didn't convey was the systematic thoroughness with which humanity had approached the problem of Void Swarm extermination. This hadn't been a series of battles, it had been an industrial process, as methodical and efficient as any manufacturing operation. Admiral Chen is requesting a meeting with all Allied commanders, reported the communications officer. She says it's time for the final phase. As they made their way to the human flagship, Zixt reflected on how much had changed since that first diplomatic meeting 6 months ago. The Indomitable was still recognizably the same ship, but it had been modified extensively during the campaign. Its hull now bore the scars of dozens of engagements, and its weapon systems had been upgraded with technologies captured from defeated swarm forces. But more than that, the ship felt different. The humans aboard it moved with the confidence of beings who had spent months doing exactly what they were designed to do. They had found their purpose, and that purpose was the systematic elimination of threats to organic life in the galaxy. The conference room where Admiral Chen waited was filled with representatives from 37 different species, the largest military alliance in recorded history. But despite the diversity of beings present, there was no question about who was in charge. Admiral Chen stood at the center of the room like a predator surrounded by prey animals that had learned to hunt alongside her. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings, she began without preamble, our intelligence services have located the Void Swarm's ultimate source. A holographic display activated, showing a region of space beyond the galaxy's edge. The image was dominated by a massive structure that defied easy comprehension. Part artificial construction, part biological organism, part something else entirely. This is the Nexus, Chen continued. The original Void Swarm entity. Everything we've been fighting, every tendril, every hive, every individual organism, has been an extension of this single intelligence. Destroy the Nexus, and the Void Swarm ceases to exist. The room erupted in excited murmurs as the implications sank in. After months of systematic extermination campaigns, they were looking at the possibility of ending the threat permanently. But Zixther noticed that Admiral Chen's expression remained grimly serious. The challenge, she continued, is that the Nexus is not defenseless. Our long-range probes estimate that it controls approximately 10 million combat organisms, plus defensive installations that we haven't fully catalogued. It's also located in intergalactic space, which means we'll be operating at the extreme limit of our supply lines. Admiral Vorthak of the Hegemony, now a fervent supporter of the human campaign, leaned forward. What are your tactical recommendations? Chen's smile was the predatory expression that Zixt had learned to associate with humanity at its most dangerous. Total war. The plan she outlined was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. The Allied fleet would approach the Nexus from multiple directions, using gravity manipulation to create artificial wormholes that would allow rapid deployment across the entire battle space. Once engaged, they would deploy every weapon system developed during the campaign: biological warfare, self-replicating machinery, philosophical viruses, and weapons that Zixt still didn't fully understand. The goal, Chen explained, is not just to defeat the Nexus, but to ensure that nothing like the Void Swarm can ever threaten the galaxy again. We're going to sterilize that entire region of space. The logistics required was staggering. The human industrial base, already operating at unprecedented capacity, would be pushed beyond theoretical limits. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of equipment that could be produced would be committed to the operation. What about casualties? Asked Admiral Thress of the Synthetic Collective. Chen's expression didn't change. Irrelevant. This is an extinction-level threat to all organic life in the galaxy. We do whatever it takes. Zixt found himself thinking about the human approach to warfare, not just the weapons and tactics, but the philosophical framework that underpinned everything they did. Other species fought wars to achieve political objectives, to gain territory or resources or strategic advantage. Humans fought wars to solve problems permanently. The fleet that departed for the Nexus 3 weeks later was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Nearly 100,000 vessels of every conceivable type and configuration, carrying weapon systems that ranged from the conventional to the barely comprehensible. At its center were the human ships, dark and angular, and somehow ominous, surrounded by the more elegant vessels of their allies, like wolves leading a pack of hunting dogs. The journey to intergalactic space took 2 months, and by the time they arrived at their destination, the Void Swarm was ready for them. The Nexus hung in space like a malignant star, its surface crawling with activity as millions of organisms prepared to defend their progenitor. It was beautiful and terrible, a construction that suggested intelligence vast and alien and utterly hostile to organic life. "All ships," came Admiral Chen's voice over the fleet communication system. "This is what we've been building toward. Today, we end the Void Swarm forever. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves, but for every species that will evolve in this galaxy over the next billion years. Make it count." The battle that followed lasted 18 hours and redefined the concept of total warfare. The Void Swarm's initial attack was everything the Alliance had expected: waves of organisms that adapted and evolved even as they fought, coordinated assaults that should have overwhelmed any conceivable defense. But humanity had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario, and their allies had learned to fight like humans. The first phase of the engagement saw the deployment of weapons that attacked the swarm's coordination systems, philosophical viruses that convinced individual organisms that their collective consciousness was a form of slavery, biological agents that severed the neural connections between swarm entities, reality manipulation devices that made it impossible for the organisms to maintain quantum entanglement across vast distances. The second phase was purely destructive. The Allied fleet unleashed everything they had learned about killing Void Swarm entities: kinetic weapons that struck with planetary-scale force, energy beams that operated on frequencies the swarm couldn't adapt to, self-replicating machines that converted enemy matter into more weapons. But it was the third phase that showed the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of when they decided something needed to be extinct. The humans deployed what they called conceptual weapons, devices that didn't attack the swarm's matter or energy, but their very existence as a concept. Machines that edited reality to make it impossible for silicon-based hive minds to exist. Weapons that retroactively prevented the Void Swarm from ever having evolved in the first place. Zixt watched in horrified fascination as the Nexus began to unravel, not just physically, but conceptually. The vast intelligence that had spawned the galactic threat was being edited out of existence, its very possibility being removed from the universe's operating parameters. When it was over, there was nothing left but empty space and the Allied fleet hanging in the void like victorious hunters over the body of their prey. "Threat eliminated," reported the sensor operator, her voice carrying a note of stunned disbelief. Long-range sweeps confirmed no Void Swarm signatures anywhere in detectable space. Admiral Chen's response was characteristically understated. Good. Signal the fleet to begin salvage operations. No sense wasting the raw materials. As the Allied ships began the long journey home, Ziax reflected on what he had witnessed. Humanity had kept their promise. They had exterminated the Void Swarm completely, permanently, and with a thoroughness that ensured the threat could never return. But more than that, they had shown the galaxy what was possible when a species truly committed to solving a problem. The Void Swarm had seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, but humanity had proven that there was no such thing, only problems that required sufficient application of intelligence, resources, and systematic violence. In cantinas and trading posts across the galaxy, new stories were already being told about the humans. Stories of the species that had looked at an extinction-level threat and decided it needed to be extinct instead. Tales of beings who had turned their own planet's attempts to kill them into weapons.
Who had spent millennia learning to be more dangerous than everything else in their environment.
The humans had become more than just another species in the galactic community. They had become a force of nature themselves, the universe's answer to threats that needed answering, problems that needed solving, enemies that needed killing. And as Zix watched the human ships disappearing into hyperspace, heading back to their small blue world in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy, he realized that the stories were all true. Earth had indeed produced the perfect survivors, and the galaxy was a safer place because of it.